I'm Jeff Kueter, president of the George Marshall Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here this morning for our discussion of the economic and political realities of national carbon tax. We're convening this forum under the auspices of our Washington Roundtable on Science and Public Policy. That's a continuing series at the Institute that's designed to bring together scientists, engineers, economists, and others with more of a technical bent with the public policy community to discuss issues of importance, of which climate change has been a keen interest of the Institute for these many years. Today's forum, of course, is looking at this key economic policy decision that is encapsulated in several pieces of legislation on Capitol Hill and been the subject of numerous think tank and economic analyses over the years as a way to structure national policy to control carbon emissions and purportedly to attack the problem of anthropogenic climate change. Well, the study that we commissioned that we're releasing today, that was offered by our colleague James DeLong of the Convergence Law Institute, summarizes the political and economic forces that we believe undermine the case for a national carbon tax. At a minimum, they should give pause to our consideration of such a policy proposal because the flaws that Jim points out in his piece are quite real, are based on our experience with similar sets of proposals, and ought to be factored into the discussions about the economic and political efficiencies of a carbon tax. The marketing pieces and the flyer that you've got in front of you enumerate the 5 principal reasons that Jim raises in his paper, and I won't repeat them here. I presume he'll speak to them in greater detail. But suffice to say, from my perspective in looking at this particular issue, the main argument in favor of this principal proposal is that you can make it somehow revenue neutral or offset other taxes with by imposing a carbon tax. And for me, as a student of politics, I think that requires you to accept a quid pro quo that just is not one that is sustainable over a long period of time. You're going to accept a deal whose terms are quite changeable given the changing political winds. So the way our proceedings today will be structured, I'll invite Jim up to give a briefing on the study, and then we'll take Q&A briefly with him for about 5 or 10 minutes or so if you've got specific questions about the study, and then I'll come back up and introduce our panel, and they'll comment on not only the study but on the issue generally, and then we'll have one grand Q&A session to close it out. So it's my pleasure to introduce James DeLong, the Vice President and Senior Analyst at the Convergence Law Institute. That's a nonprofit dedicated to research and education on public policy issues in the areas of energy, technology, and intellectual property. He's also an adjunct scholar at the Competitive Enterprise Institute and the Heartland Institute. He has been a senior fellow at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, a senior analyst at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and the vice president of the National Legal Center for the Public Interest. He's got many other accolades in his career, not the least of which is being the author of this provocative little book, Ending Big Sis, which I strongly encourage you all to take a look at. It is a very enjoyable read, and it gives you great insights into how Jim approaches the world, which is thought-provoking. It's my pleasure to bring Jim up to the podium, and I want to thank him in doing so for the great work that he did for us. It's been a real pleasure working with him. Jim?
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. I will keep this fairly brief because I already know what I think, so I want to hear what the panelists think, and which I will find much more interesting anyway. But I will start by saying that I was once took a job at the Federal Trade Commission, and in being introduced to my new and young and brash staff, one young woman looked at me and said, "What are your qualifications for this job?" And I explained as best I could, but I thought I'd start this by saying what my qualifications to address this topic are. One is that I'm a lawyer, and that, of course, programs you to a certain nastiness and looking at things and saying, is that true, and all that sort of thing. And that's very useful when you look at the carbon tax, because the discussions are certainly full of as many things that should indeed be questioned. A second qualification is that Bill O'Keefe knows me, in that I spent several years working as a lawyer and consultant on environmental and energy matters, and most of it for his operation at the American Petroleum Institute when he was vice president there. And that was a first-rate operation, first-rate intellectual operation. in the dedication in the Big Sis book, I said, quote, "It showed how good trade association staff, willing and determined to deal honestly with public issues, can make significant contributions to the public welfare." And that's a statement I would stand by. I would say, unfortunately, that the quality of environmental rulemaking especially has deteriorated since then, and the incentives for trade association staff to approach it in that spirit are decidedly lacking these days. A third qualification, though, and perhaps the best one, is that I once worked for the good old U.S. Bureau of the Budget before it was OMB. In fact, we didn't mess around with management. And back at the end of the Grace Society. and I was there when it was trying to impose what was called program budgeting, which was an attempt to force government agencies to adopt mission statements, develop 5-year plans, and in general engage in other appurtenances with central planning. And to say, in short, I was a central planner. You know, there aren't too many people in the U.S. who can own up to that. You know, there are a lot of them there now who won't admit it, but, you know, we were sort of there blatantly. Now, to say this effort did not work would be somewhat of an understatement. But it taught some useful things. And one is that Hayek is indeed right. Central planning is very difficult. And in a point made several times in the paper, the key issue is that in trying to predict the future, the decision trees branch out so quickly that they just overwhelm you. You know, the quote in the paper is from the systems analyst E.S. Quaid, who pointed out that if you take a decision tree with 10 levels and you make a best guess for each level and you hit 60%, which is a very high percentage, that the chances that you actually predict the outcome are less than 1%. And if you give the decision maker a preternatural 90% success rate in predicting, the chances that you will predict the outcome are less than a third. And you know, that is another concept the systems analysts had, was what was called dominant information, which is that instead of trying to analyze everything, you just looked at the one thing, one or two things, and realized that they just overwhelmed the decision and nothing else really mattered that much. The fact that it is almost impossible to predict a multi-tier decision tree is dominant information, and it overwhelms everything. Now, we did find, though, in the Budget Bureau, that there was a form of analysis that was very useful, and that was that people were always bringing proposals to you. You know, or the agencies were always bringing proposals. And so what you did was ask, what assumptions have to be true for this proposal to make sense? I don't recall ever finding one that did make sense, as a matter of fact. And later, my son worked in the Clinton Treasury Department. My son, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is a strongly Democratic economist. And the difference between the two of us is sort of great amusement in both circles for which we move over somewhat different reasons. But anyway, he commented to me once that his job, the job of the Treasury, was to try to stop at least a third of the bad proposals that came through, which my response was, then why are you a Democrat? Because that leaves 2/3 that are going through unscathed. He did not have a good answer to that, I might add. But anyway, so the issue is when you're analyzing things, you say, all right, we'll start from the assumption that we're going to adopt policy X. Now, what has to be true for that to make sense? And as you unpack the assumptions, you would often find that either the people had just erred, or mostly that they just made assumptions without any data whatsoever, and without any reason for them. Now, that's the basic approach that I took in this paper. The starting point is there are many people, many of them quite worthy of respect, including people like Brookings and Resources for the Future, who are endorsing a carbon tax and think it's a good idea. So my question is, all right, what assumptions do they have to be making to make this a good idea? And I must say I started out from the view that the carbon tax might be a good idea. You know, I'm skeptical of all the proposals, but, you know, still I thought it might be a good idea. And I got steadily more skeptical as I got along until finally I just sort of thought, you know, that the whole thing was ridiculous. Now, when you start trying to unpack the assumptions, a preliminary issue arises, and essentially it is sort of, what context are you looking in? Because looking at the carbon tax is a bit like a shell game with 3 shells. And there are 3 different, quite distinct contexts, and the assumptions are sort of different for each one. Again, something that doesn't get talked about much. But you know, you have one context. The carbon tax says carbon harms things. We have this economic theory that says put tax on harmful things. For this, you find out how much the harm is, the level of the harm. You put the tax on to equal that, in this case at the social cost of carbon. Then once that in fact makes all the harm internalized into the producer, and so now you have a perfectly functioning market that reflects all the costs and benefits. Voila! That's one carbon tax. The next carbon tax is the tax revenue getter's carbon tax, which is, good God, we need money. Where can we get it? Well, the income tax. We have a system where about $2 trillion ought to go to the income tax. $1 trillion is actually collected because there's so many loopholes of various sorts. And to collect that trillion costs $400 billion. This is not a promising line of attack, especially because half the people don't pay it anyway, and thus have no investment whatsoever in avoiding further wasteful expenditures. So obviously we need something new. The states object to a VAT. Though that would be, many people think that would be logical. The government sort of tapped out of sources. But a carbon tax, then you can combine that with the idea of taxing bads, and you begin to have a winning hand. Now, of course, when you get into that, you immediately sort of neglect the fact that this has no relation to perfecting an energy market. You're dealing in a totally different system, and a totally different set of assumptions, set of trade-offs, and costs and benefits. But we aren't done yet, because there's a third shell, and the P is usually really under that one, and that is simply environmental control. And that is, in that context, you simply have a large number of true believers who want to wipe out carbon to the extent possible and beyond. The carbon tax is one tool to do this. So you put a tax on carbon, and then if you're Henry Waxman, you put a bigger tax on carbon, and then you keep raising the tax on carbon until it becomes 120% or whatever. And the idea here has nothing to do with perfecting an energy market. It has nothing to do with collecting revenues, because in Waxman's view, if you're successful, you will collect no revenues. You will reach the point on the Laffer curve where you have suppressed it. So there are no trade-offs. And there, the whole assumption is that you can somehow use this interchangeably as a tool of central planning, in which you alternate with regulation and other things. But as I say, the assumptions on that one are totally different than any of the other two. And so all or most of the discussions of the carbon tax sort of just put these three contexts into one mixture and stir. Like last night at dinner, somebody I guess it was a daiquiri or something, it was part strawberry, part lemon, and you put it together, it's called a swirl. And this is sort of the carbon tax swirl. And all those things are just mushed together, and they aren't unpacked, and it's often very hard to tell just what you're talking about. So the fundamental issue is just what sets of assumptions are involved in all of these things, and I thought of sort of going through and taking each one and matching it with assumptions, and I tend to be sort of a mad taxonomist when I write anyway, but that one sort of would have gotten overwhelming. But so the second part of the paper, it really just goes through all the possible assumptions that are applicable to any of these things, and produces what I call the 5 circles of carbon tax hell. And you look at it, the people, you have to assume that doing this, with considerable pain, would have some effect on temperature. But in fact, no. Actually, as several very good researchers have shown, the effect of a U.S. carbon tax, even one that had serious effects on the U.S., would have almost no effect on global temperature. And in fact, one of the things that everyone has agreed on is that it really doesn't make a lot of sense for us to do a carbon tax unless we get other countries on board. And by other countries, we mean China. And in fact, if you look at the end of the paper, while there are a number of people who claim that China is, on the verge of doing a carbon tax, I don't believe it. I found 2 sort of vague statements from some unnamed official at the Ministry of Finance saying a carbon tax would be a good idea. And the Washington Post then picked this up and put together a lot of things there. But when I look at official Chinese documents, they're sort of saying, you broke it, you fix it. And we'll adapt, and by the way, you can pay us a lot of money. And so, the idea that China is going to endorse on it, going to pick up anything that it thinks will in fact harm its development is highly unlikely. The second assumption that I found, and this is especially true of the economic studies, I was looking at these things that show relatively small impact on GDP going out 35 years. But I couldn't figure out what energy they assumed we were going to have in 35 years. And I did find one where sort of you looked at the energy mix they projected for 2050, and 50% of our energy was coming from offshore wind. And I sort of thought about that. And I said, well, you know, I seem to recall that the basic introduction of electricity took about 75 years. I'm not quite sure how we introduce offshore wind to meet 50% of our requirements in 30 years. And you know, you find this again and again. Then you find the EIA studies. And they say, well, we're projecting out current technology sort of until 2030, and after that, we'll need some research. And you know, but it's only going to be 3% of GDP in 2050. And you know, at this point, you're sort of what? And it really is. You know, I will stand corrected if the economists want to say, or if the modelers want to say I insult them. But I did talk with my son about this at breakfast a couple weeks ago. I said, can you believe these people are projecting out 35 years? And he said, well, actually, his view had always been that if you went out to 10, you were in the blue sky, and at 5, you might have a fighting chance. And that strikes me as more likely. I mean, you know, it's sort of weird because at the moment, I think they'd be pretty happy if they could predict GDP next year, which seems to be beyond the capabilities. But then this segues logically into another thing, which is, and if you're going to assume, you know, social costs and such, you've got to look at the benefits of carbon. You know, a number of studies that say, you know, carbon levels slightly higher than we have now would be very good. And actually, they may have been good at previous times in world history. And perhaps, you know, a few degrees don't matter. You don't look at that at all. You also get into a topic here, the general overall benefits of fossil fuels. And David can talk about this better than I can. But
don't raise the bar.
well, that reminds me, once I was making a talk that was based partly on some concepts that economist Bruce Yandel had done. And so as I looked at him sitting in the audience, I said, well, everything I know about this topic I learned from Bruce Yandel, so if I make any mistakes, it's his fault. And we're still friends, though. But you have a business you get here that I would call the appropriation of consumer surplus, which is that cheap energy, you know, consumer surplus is the amount consumers would pay as opposed to what they have to pay, in fact, for a good. And it's one of the great engines of growth. It's the rationale for competition. The competition keeps prices down, generates huge consumer surplus. So when you get into things like a carbon tax, you're essentially, the government is appropriating the consumer surplus from cheap energy and devoting it to other causes. And I can't find any analyses of the impact of that. And I sort of got interested in this topic first because it comes up in the wireless auctions. If you're auctioning off spectrum, the government is essentially taking a thing, making it a scarcity, and then siphoning off the consumer surplus and the scarcity value. But that's not going into the system to develop the wireless communication system. And so I'm not entirely sure why all my libertarian friends are so totally in favor of the spectrum auction. You know, I hate to say it in this one, but you know, Google may have a point here. Though Google on a lot of other intellectual property issues is interesting. They don't believe in property. But you do have to take into account all these other issues about the benefits of cheap energy, of fossil fuel, of CO2 generally. The next problem of unpacking the assumptions is models. And, you know, many of you, I'm sure, keep up with the literature on the climate models and the difficulty of them. And here, I think, there are a lot of good things. I don't go into that in the paper in any depth. I just sort of refer you over to the work of Heartland and Fred Singer, of Marshall. Marshall has some very distinguished scholars who worked on this, you know, CEI, Myron E. Bell, and those guys. But there's a serious question about the climate models. And there again, you know, you really are subject to dominant information. And as Lindzen has pointed out, all the models assume that the feedbacks from things like clouds and such are positive. And you get a little warming from CO2, maybe at most a degree from a doubling of CO2, which does not continue, by the way. You know, CO2 absorbs only on certain wavelengths. So you might double it and get a degree of warming, but if you double it again, you don't get another degree of warming. You know, you've exhausted its potential. But the idea is that once you get this little bit of warming, then you get cloud formation and other feedbacks that make even more warming. But as Linton points out, there's no empirical evidence of that. And in fact, the only empirical evidence we've got is the other way, that the feedbacks are negative. But the problem is, if you assume negative feedbacks in your model, you've got no problem. You know, it goes away. Well, you aren't going to get any share of this $3 billion a year government funding for climate change if you say there's no problem. So whether by corruption or by simple Darwinian selection, people who adopt the assumption that the feedback is negative are going to disappear from the system because they aren't going to get funded, they aren't going to get tenure, and they aren't going to get published except in the sort of conservative blogs and such by people like us. And then, of course, the fact that nobody is there will be used to say, well, everybody's unanimous that there's a big problem here. You know, it's a marvelous system of positive feedback, actually. But anyway, the climate models, you know, are sort of a wreck. And then, as I sort of hinted a couple minutes ago, when you turn to the economic models, you really have a similar problem in that, again, some better economists than I, like Bob Murphy, have gone through some of the models in detail. But my point is broader, and that is that almost I can't imagine doing a good model 30 years out of the future. And if you think so, try, you know, you should at least be back tested. You know, sort of take the economy in 1980, apply the assumptions, and see if you get today. You know, I don't think I wouldn't waste a lot of money doing this, I don't think. Or better yet, start in 1945 and see if you get in 1980. Actually, in 1945, all the predictions, my God, the Depression is going to renew. You know, it was only, and people wanted to be sure that the government spent the money that it was otherwise going to save on the, from cutting back the war expenditures. But so you do have this huge problem with models. And then finally, and actually the biggest category, is the idea that any carbon tax will be pure for any of these purposes. You know, any of the revenue, the energy market, or even as a matter of command and control. The idea of pure is ridiculous. I mean, any of these systems now, and this gets into the big cis point, and that is that the government has become almost infinitely corrupt in that almost everything has been captured by some special interest. And, you know, special interest can be very big. I, as an elderly person, am the biggest, most powerful special interest of all, and you better not cross us, let me tell you. You know, and we are systematically looting all you young people. And I tried to explain to my liberal daughter-in-law the other day that I thought it was very nice of her to keep subsidizing me. And she sort of didn't get the point. You know, she just sort of assumed that when she's my age, she will get it. No news for her. But, you know, but there are all sorts of interest groups. And administrative laws cease to be the rule of law. You know, I think Massachusetts, the EPA, which was the case in which they held carbon was a pollutant under the Clean Air Act, which is simply a patently ridiculous conclusion under the law. And you got 5 justices to sign off on a paper that would have flunked a first-year administrative law course. And you realize you're in trouble. You know, we are in trouble. But so you look at the income tax, you look at any state sales tax, you look at any tax at all, it comes riddled with exceptions. And you can see that in the proposals for a carbon tax, where, you know, they propose like a huge carbon tax, and then they begin trying to take out anybody who would be affected by it. You know, it would be regressive, so you've got to help them. It would hurt carbon-intensive industries, so you've got to help them. But wait a minute, that was the purpose, to make people use less carbon. So we're going to take money from the carbon that people aren't going to use and give it to the people who aren't using the carbon so that they can use the carbon. And, you know, as I say, you can go mad looking at this stuff pretty quick, and perhaps I have. But, you know, you just go through this endless series of things about the political problems and how it will work and how the system works and the chances that you will have a system that is anything, that does anything except take money from what David Stockman once called strong clients with weak claims and takes it away from strong claims from weak clients. And, you know, anybody who thinks that will not happen in this context very quickly and very substantially is not in the right city. And this does get into the bigger problem, finally, which I don't get into in the book at all. And that's the ending Big Sis book, is about this problem of the fact that almost all of government has in some fashion been captured by various special interests, and it's increasingly difficult to sort out, and that we're having an increasing loss of legitimacy of it. And legitimacy is the bedrock concept of government. The idea that the government, in fact, has a right to rule. And I noticed an astonishing poll yesterday said that almost 30% of the people think, yeah, we're going to have an armed revolution. I thought it was possible, but I would not have put 30%. I wouldn't have thought anywhere near that percentage of people thought that. But that really shows how close the crisis is. And I think the carbon tax in many ways, which is a badly flawed proposal which is not discussed in honest terms in almost any forum that I can find, is a good example of why we're approaching a crisis, or why we are in a crisis. And I have no particular prescription on how to get out of it except to say, well, at least we don't have to adopt this one. And there are no set of assumptions under which this proposal makes sense. So thank you.
So again, before I bring the panel up, we'll have time for a few questions if you have any about the particular studies or the observations that Jim's made. None? Well, I've got one.
Oh, all right.
It has to do with that notion of the quid pro quo. In your, you have op-ed pieces from former Republican administration officials. George Shultz, in particular, has been very outspoken on this issue, suggesting that a revenue neutral or another kind of tax, carbon tax proposal that might offset taxes someplace else would be a good idea, and it should be something that we all consider. Can you comment a bit on, from your observation on this notion of the quid pro quo? If we were to accept the carbon tax in exchange for a reduction in the payroll tax or a reduction in income tax rates, in your study and in your broader perceptions, is that a good deal? Is it one that we should consider?
I would think not. You would have to be a better sort of tax analyst, economist than I to answer that question definitively. But I really have a question about putting in a tax on one input and decreeing arbitrarily that that's going to be what you do. And I have a big problem with the fact, maybe I'm a Burkean conservative in that I sort of look at the last century, and there's a diagram in the study of how the growth of civilization has accorded with cheap energy. And I know that you can't necessarily say that the causation is direct, but it's certainly not something I'm willing to mess with unless you have a lot better knowledge than you have now. And it seems to me that cheap energy is really a foundation of progress in many ways. One example I've used is water, in that there are water problems all over the world. But water is largely an energy issue, in that if you have cheap energy, then you can desalinate water, you can move it, you can do all sorts of things with it. If energy is expensive, then you can't. And it's very unpredictable what happens. Now, this may change. Lockheed, I think it is, claims to have invented a filter that desalinates water at much less energy. So that, a lot of technological developments have a way of turning out to need a lot more energy than they said that was going to be saved. But no, I can't see. It seems to me the idea that this is somehow the fit topic to replace all other taxes just stems from the idea that it is a Pigovian tax on a bad, and so you can use it, and sort of hitchhikes on that. But as an independent tax proposal, I'm very skeptical. Mr. Lucier.
Yeah, Jim, you've talked about the trade-off of a carbon tax for some other form of tax, but occasionally one sees the suggestion that a carbon tax would be a trade-off for Clean Air Act reform or something like that, which of course NRDC and the environmental left say will never happen in a million years. But from a public choice standpoint, how would you think about this alleged trade of a carbon tax for regulatory relief, not tax relief?
Well, it's axiomatic in thinking about public policy issues that if you can impose some sort of market system, you're better off than if you do it with command and control regulation. And certainly a pollution tax for a pollutant makes sense, where you can actually see that it's a pollutant and see the harm. The problem really is putting CO2 in that category of social bad. Because it's not clear that it is, and two, it's so ubiquitous that you can't really find any, you can't really put a price on it or actually find that there is harm at all. So, so you're stuck in that you're taking a theory that applies to one rather limited situation, and then trying to generalize it into an atmospheric substance that's worldwide. And I just don't see, again, I don't see the chain of logic that leads to the generalization.
There's a, speaking of quid pro quos, that one way of looking at the carbon tax is as a market where the proponents are in the demand side of the market, and your job is to expropriate all the consumer surplus. And it may, for example, I mean, it could well be that part of expropriating that consumer surplus would be repeal of Clean Air Act Section 108 and 109. That would be an interesting test of willingness to pay on the part of carbon tax advocates. I mean, again, trying to figure out ways of making it revenue neutral are really, really hard. I mean, to be clear, you need a constitutional amendment to do that. And that's, that could happen, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that. I'm not sure I hold my breath on the 108, 109 going away, but it's a way of establishing a price that, at least, and it's an empirical question as to whether that price would be worth it.
Yeah, I did not pay a lot of attention to that issue, would you get regulatory reform, because when you look at the environmentalists, their view on that is just so adamant, and the view of their congressional supporters is so adamant, that I really did not consider that a serious proposal. And, if the environmentalists were to put one on the table, then you might have to consider it, but certainly, and say, well, would you get that trade-off? But even there, I would have real problems because of their instinct, like in the latest Waxman bill, I think it is, that you just start out with a tax, then you just keep raising it, I think 8% a year, forever. And so they are, part of the problem in the political system now is that no bargains are guaranteed. There is no mechanism to keep bargains. We have no solution to the prisoner's dilemma problems, partly because of the Chevron doctrine, the courts used to be the enforcers of the bargains and regulation. And Chevron, which defers to the agencies on everything, ruined that system. The courts ceased to be the enforcers of the bargain.
Well, I know there are other questions. Let's save those for the panel. Thank you, Jim. Thank you. So to comment on these issues, we've asked 3 individuals to come and join us to offer their perspective on the economic as well as political dimensions of a carbon tax. And we'll start with David Kreutzer, the research fellow in energy economics and climate change at the Heritage Foundation. And there was a little brief that we had on the front table that he just released with a colleague earlier this month. If you didn't get a chance to get a copy of that, please visit the Marshall Institute website after the event is over, and we'll have a link to it there. But it's a fascinating data analysis of the economic implications of carbon tax. He'll be followed by Scott Segal, the founding partner in the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell Giuliani and the director of the Electric Reliability Coordinating Council. And if you follow energy and environmental policy issues, you'll see Scott's name frequently cited in the media. He's truly an expert on the political affairs and dimensions of these issues. And then closing out the panel is my colleague at the Marshall Institute, William O'Keefe. He's the CEO of the Institute, and as Jim mentioned, a former vice president at the American Petroleum Institute and a longtime follower of energy and environmental issues. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. David,
speak from the table,
you certainly can speak from the table.
Thanks for having me, and I want to commend Jim's paper. It's much more thorough than anything I've written. It covers pretty much all the topics. It does a great job. It's a great resource. I have to defend the economists who say we can't predict what GDP is next year. We certainly can. It will be 1.5% higher than it is this year, plus or minus 3%. So, well, let me go over very briefly what we did at Heritage, which was an analysis of a proposed Boxer-Sanders carbon tax, which is a tax that will start at $20 per ton of CO2, I think about a year from now, and then rise at 5% a year for who knows how long until we have no carbon left. Not too surprisingly, the carbon-intensive industries get hit hard. But it also, because of that, impacts the economy. We found that the GDP losses, if you do them in a family of 4, that is divided by population, multiplied times 4, come out to $1,000 per family per year on average between now and 2030. We at least didn't have the hubris to go to 2050, and I would agree that even 2030 is a stretch. By 2016, which is less of a stretch, the economy will have 400,000 fewer jobs than without the carbon tax. Coal production will drop by 40% by 2030. Excuse me, coal employment. Coal production drops by 60%. Gasoline prices, not too surprisingly, rise, and so do electricity rates. They go up by 20% in 2017 and 30% in 2030. So these are a bunch of not too surprising things. The EIA, the Energy Information Administration, did side cases last year with the annual outlook for 2012 on a $25 and a $15 carbon tax. Our numbers come in somewhere in the middle. And what sort of assumptions did we make? We made most of the assumptions that the EIA made. And we said there are a couple of things you could click. What do you want to do with the revenue? We said, well, let's just give it back to everybody, not waste it on Solyndra, all right, not increase government spending. Now, if you went to the AEI conference last fall, where they were hyping what a great thing this carbon tax was going to be, Robertson Williams, the economist from Resources for the Future and the University of Maryland, who did their research, said, well, actually giving money back to people is the worst option. And you get a huge negative, well, duh, okay, we see here you're going to get a negative impact. And he's saying what we really need to do, and then he lists these things, and you think, this guy is auditioning for the role of Curly in the Three Stooges Go to Washington. They're just not going to happen. You know, you're waiting for Mo to come out and dope slap the guy. Well, for instance, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to cut the top marginal tax rates. This is an administration that wants to tax Joe the plumber for making $200,000. You're now going to cut his rate. That's not going to happen. Get rid of the corporate income tax. If they propose that, I'm going to start working for the Center for American Progress because it's going to be too easy to demagogue. You're raising grandma's heating bill so that you can cut Goldman Sachs' income tax? That's not going to happen. You know, you pick whatever tax. They say, well, we're going to make it revenue neutral, so get away from the Robert and Williams to what the other proponents. Revenue neutrality in Washington's mind means we spend the money. You know, we don't put it in a mattress. Well, that increases government revenue and it increases spending. Well, Jim went over the environmental impact pretty well. Zilch. All right. I mean, this is not hard to do. It's not much debate even from the other side. They then say, well, it's the first step. You know, like, okay, cut carbon 80% is the first step. You have a quarter step left before we can't start breathe. All right, you could cut it 100%. We're going to get China to come along. Come on, China and India, they've already said we're not doing this unless you pay us. We're not going to do anything to hurt our economy. Maybe China's going to impose a carbon tax. What does it mean to impose a carbon tax on a state-owned electricity generating company? Okay, here, go here, now it's here, we're happy. Okay, will you do it on yourselves? Reduce regulation. Okay, you know, this is, boy, they're striking close to the heart here for a conservative. Would you really? No, they won't. And there are a variety of reasons why they won't. First of all, they said they won't. You can look at Waxman. He said, no, we can't trust the market to reduce the CO2 to the level we need it to be cut to. You know, and all the economists are saying, well, you need to raise the tax. And of course, he's willing to do that, raise it higher and higher, but we can't trust the market. One of my professors, Jim Buchanan, a Nobel laureate who died earlier this year, great guy, he actually outlined, I think back in the 70s, why you're not going to see a tax on these things, but you'll see regulation or a cap and trade. And the reason is, with a carbon tax or a tax on SO2 or NOx, whatever you want, not only do the firms have to use the efficient amount of control technology and pay for that, they also have to pay for all their emissions up to that point. Whereas if you just have a regulation, they adopt the equipment that they need to meet the target, but they don't have to pay the tax on the stuff they do emit. And so we can see that they would actually be willing to have a less efficient regulatory scheme than an efficient tax scheme. because they get to keep more money. And in some cases, when you just drive up the marginal cost, that is for the last unit of production, and you drive that up more than you drive up the average cost, their profits can actually increase. And we saw a lot of this. This is why I think some of the generators were salivating over Waxman Markey, because they were going to be getting enough of the allowances to make them whole on the first part of the emissions. Everybody was going to have to charge a price that reflected that marginal cost of buying the allowance, and they could actually do better. So yes, the carbon tax would be more efficient. I still don't think we need it, but it's not going to happen. All right. Let's look at the notion we're going to tax a bad. Everybody says, well, I don't know what the impact of carbon is, but I know it's not zero. Okay, well, maybe it's positive, but let's say maybe it's not zero. And therefore, we need some carbon tax because it is a negative externality. Well, that's not true. All right. These people listened to the first half of that econ lecture, but they didn't listen to the second half. There are a variety of ways of controlling a negative externality, regulation being one of them. Now, economists don't like those as much. We much prefer, directly taxing whatever it is that's bad. And please don't quote me as saying that I think carbon is bad, because I'm far from convinced of that right now. But it's not clear that we haven't over-controlled some of these pollutants. Because of that public choice Buchanan explanation I gave earlier, it's very conceivable that industry would acquiesce to over-control as opposed to an efficient tax, because they don't have to pay for those early emissions. All right. Well, if that's the case, and we have, people talk about the mercury rule and all these other rules, so many of these rules are clearly carbon rules. They're to cut carbon dioxide. So we may already be controlling it past the point, even if you give them the $20, $30, $40 per ton negative externality. Another Pigouvian point. If you tax an externality at more than double the external cost, you make the market less efficient, because you are creating greater deadweight loss from the inefficiency you induce than you gain from efficiency by taxing this negative externality. But that doesn't really matter. Washington doesn't know about that stuff. They know about money comes in, money goes out, who gets this, who doesn't get that. And so when they talk about revenue neutrality, so many people here miss the fact that there are incentive problems, that you change behavior, you change the way the economy operates, you make it less efficient. They simply say, well, we've given the money back to people that we took in, how can that harm the economy? Money comes out of the economy, money goes into the economy. Well, let me give a hypothetical example. Suppose we said we wanted to tax cars because we know how horrible they are. They cause pollution, they cause traffic, they get you where you want to go on time, stuff like that. Let's say we tax them at infinity. Now, I think that's far enough up the Laffer curve that people will buy zero. Okay? So, infinity tax on infinities, I guess, and we have zero automobiles. Is revenue neutral. No money comes in, you don't need to reduce any taxes anywhere else. This is not going to hurt the economy because we have this revenue neutral tax. But you've destroyed the automobile industry. You now have people, taking hours to get to where they want to go. You're jamming up buses. Certainly there will be innovative responses of all sorts, but it will not undo the damage you've done from eliminating automobiles. So revenue neutrality really doesn't make sense unless you are talking about some sort of damaging tax, which they're not going to cut. I think that's all the points I had to make. So thank you.
Okay. All right, now it's the time that we shift from. I'm Scott Segal at Bracewell Giuliani, and as Jeff indicated, also run the Electric Reliability Coordinating Council, but have worked with a broad range of industries that produce the almighty BTU, whether it be oil and gas, or whether it be manufacturing industries that are indeed energy intensive, or whether it be electric power generators. And now we're going to turn from the dismal science of economics to the even more dismal science of political science, and we're going to talk a little bit about what these proposals, what kind of trade-offs would occur, and really what are the chances that we'll have a spirited discussion of carbon taxes. Let me get my prediction out of the way at the front end. I think the chances are very unlikely that we adopt a carbon tax. I think the chances are 100% that we'll have a spirited discussion of a carbon tax, because we're staring down the barrel of between 2 to 4 years of comprehensive tax reform. I'm just basing that on history repeating itself and what happened in '86. And I'm also basing it on the fact that with Max Baucus's retirement being announced at the Senate Finance Committee, it frees him to be the Max we always knew he could be. And I'm not sure that's a good thing, but it frees him to make political deals that might not play so well in a resource-rich state like Montana, but that he might think are good tax policy. Now, do I think that makes it more likely we'll have a carbon tax or less likely that we'll have a carbon tax? I have no idea, because it depends on what Max Baucus thinks. But I do know this, and something that was actually not well covered in the reporting on his retirement. Dave Camp on the House side is essentially retiring too. Let me explain what I mean. Not from the United States Congress, but he's term limited from the House Ways and Means Committee chairmanship. So now both Dave Camp and Max Baucus are in the same position, and if they wish to be inordinately creative, they could certainly do so. But I do think there are significant political structural reasons why a carbon tax would be difficult to pull off. First of all, let's talk about vehicles. How do you get from here to there with a carbon tax? Well, you could do it on a standalone basis. So every member of Congress would have the honor of voting directly up or down on a carbon tax. This strikes me as a very difficult, the Russian judge gives this a 10.0 on the degree of difficulty scale. So I don't think that's I don't think that's going to happen. And largely because it requires political accountability very directly, and you know how Congress feels about that. You could make it part of the extenders package. In other words, the package of tax items we must consider, kind of like the swallows returning to Capistrano. We must do it every year and talk about extenders. The problem with that is I don't know if you've noticed, it's not an extender. We don't have a carbon tax right now, so it would be the square peg in the round hole, and it would stick out almost so much that it would become a standalone vote again, and I think that would be difficult. Plus, how many times do we have creative discussions about tax policy on the extenders package where at the last minute the majority leader or somebody runs down the hallway and says, oh, extenders are going to be clean this year? Happens almost every time. So like Lucy with the football, I don't think we'll have a carbon tax kick on the extenders package, which leaves it only as part of comprehensive tax reform. And as I suggested at the outset, that's a 2 to 4 year process, and there is the best chance, 100% chance of spirited debate, and a much less chance of actual passage. Why such a bad chance of actual passage? Well, what makes carbon tax different than so many other tax proposals that raise revenue and try to do so in ways that are relatively hidden? You know, a big spread that maybe people won't notice on any one line item on a tax return they have to file. What makes it so different? Well, the sugar that goes with the carbon tax is the fact that it is a spirited attempt to address carbon. So then you have to ask yourself the political question, does America desire a spirited attempt to address carbon? And I would just say that the available evidence is very inconsistent on that point. First of all, if you look to last month's Gallup poll on the same issue, there was the Enviros made much of the fact that the percentage was up a little bit in favor of taking carbon action. It is, however, down considerably from the high water mark of what year? 2000. Was the high water mark for wishing to take strong federal action on carbon. So they're in a hole, and perhaps they see light at the top of the hole, but it is not enough to pass a carbon tax. Plus, we have lots of test votes. For example, Jim Inhofe in what is called the vote-a-rama, you may recall, which is the process during budget time where we vote on lots of things. It's great. It's like being able to take a poll of the U.S. Senate. All the votes are meaningless, but people have to express an opinion. Well, Inhofe had an amendment which banned the EPA from taking action of any sort on carbon. Okay? Now, you would think that'd be a bolder move, say, than adopting a carbon tax at $20 a ton, right? I would think. And it gained 47 votes in favor in the U.S. Senate. Well, you know what Senate math is like on controversial votes. If you've already got 47 that are willing to erase carbon jurisdiction from the EPA, methinks you would have trouble putting together a working coalition to adopt the carbon tax. If you take an even more interesting or timely yardstick, which is where people stand on Keystone, where the primary argument against Keystone is a carbon critique, the polls and the Senate are aligned. 2/3 of Americans want Keystone built. At least 2/3 of Americans want Keystone built, depending on how you word it. And 62% of United States senators voted in favor of the Keystone Amendment at Votorama. And of those 62, if you'll recall, 17 were Democrats. So this does not sound like a great time to advance a carbon tax. And in the foreseeable future, I think it would be difficult. Okay, what's wrong with a carbon tax? You've heard a lot. You've heard the economic case, political case against it both. And by the way, I agree with the assessment of the report. It's a fun read. I skimmed through it. I love it because if you're into making speeches or writing papers of your own, there's so much to crib out of Jim's report. Right. It'll keep us all working for decades. Okay, political obstacles. First, we've talked about tepid political response or public response for carbon policy. Second, macroeconomic threats of the type that both Jim and Dave have already discussed, and of course that's definitely true. As an unreconstructed old liberal that doesn't wear ties to events at the Capitol Hill Club, on principle, I will tell you that I like to spend some time on regressivity. Because if anyone thinks that a carbon tax is somehow a liberal policy, I mean, and that's not liberal in the classic economic sense, but liberal in the political sense, I have to really call, well, you know what, on that. I mean, first of all, you know, this notion that we're going to rebate the money from the carbon tax is hilarious to me. Do you know? Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? There is a federal carbon tax right now. It's called the gasoline excise tax. Okay, it's on a carbonaceous fuel. It has the widest possible. You know, everyone who drives. That's all you have to do to qualify to pay the excise tax, and the excise tax is, in a sense, revenue neutral, isn't it? Well, in other words, we're supposed to sequester, in the old definition of that term, the money that comes from the highway trust fund. I'm sorry, that comes from the excise tax, supposed to go to the highway trust fund, where it's supposed to be promptly spent on highway infrastructure. Now, that is the law. That is federal law, okay? And that does not happen. All right, we hang on to it. We use it for budget balancing exercises. We glacially slow improve the actual highway infrastructure of the country, even though they're compelled by law to do it. So I think that the case that we will somehow create ready-made pass-throughs for money that comes from carbon tax to any one of a number of good objectives. Second, who says that it's going to go back to address regressivity? Who says it's going to go to LIHEAP or other federal programs to address high-cost energy? Who says it's going to go to income tax cuts? And if it does go to income tax cuts, well, you know, the people that are hardest hit by the carbon tax don't pay income tax. Oops, inconvenient truth. You know, right? And in fact, they said, well, how about payroll taxes? We'll pick up the folks that aren't. You know what? There's even a large chunk of them that don't pay payroll taxes either. So, you know, the people that are hit hardest, you know, think, for example, the elderly, the poor, or even worse, the elderly living in poverty, who are the most susceptible to energy price increases, are not affected by the payroll tax rebate process or by an income tax rebate process. So, you know, it is regressive. They cannot shake it. You can say that it's not, but it is absolutely regressive. And the number of households that get their act together to apply for LIHEAP funding, there are also certain transactional barriers to application for that. So the notion that they'll address regressivity is silly. Plus, liberal supporters of the carbon tax do not all support those mechanisms to address regressivity. The politicians do, but I was listening to a retiree from NASA the other day. I'm sorry, Jim Hansen the other day, and a cranky retiree at that, and he you probably saw has come down like 2 tons of bricks on the Boxer carbon tax bill, right? Because he says, how dare they try and take this money and address regressivity with it? How dare they do that? This money needs to all go into green technology investment. Because, you know, the record of the federal government at collecting tax revenue and distributing it is almost as good as their record at picking winners and losers in green technology, right? So that's what they're supposed to do and I believe he does speak for a chunk of the, you know, the global climate glitterati out there who believe that this money should all be reinvested into federal decisions over green technology, for which there's, as I say, little good record. Consumer issues we've discussed. It's a double hit at the pump. I realize that this spring's driving season isn't as bad as some spring driving seasons, but nonetheless, there's political resonance to the price of gasoline at the pump. We already tax gasoline, but a carbon tax would make that more expensive. And by making electricity more expensive, it again makes gasoline even more expensive, since one of the major operational expenses to running a petroleum refinery is purchasing, you guessed it, electricity. So we've got problems there. Dealing with international competitive concerns, we've talked about that. You know, at least a 15% reduction in most proposals for energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries. We've talked about, I'd like to point out also a problem with baseload electric production. Look, we have had in this country, you might have noticed, a slight shifting in the pie of where we derive our electricity from. With coal on the weekend, because of both a suite of EPA regulations as well as conversions to natural gas based on the low commodity price of gas. Well, most of the low-hanging fruit of facilities that could be converted to gas facilities, that's occurred, okay? And assuming we have something called an economic recovery, and maybe the carbon tax is just a proposal to prevent that from occurring, but assuming we do have an economic recovery, the additional base load is going to have to come in part back from your old friend reliable coal. We have done what we have done for natural gas, and now it's time for serious planning to occur. The carbon tax makes that is one more step that makes that more difficult to do. So again, very problematic. The last item I wanted to cover has to do with the decoupling of the carbon tax from regulatory reform. And it's a couple of pages, about a page and a half in Jim's report. There was some discussion from Dave on this as well. I want to make something crystal clear. You have probably seen some corporate leaders suggest they would at least contemplate a carbon tax. But the overwhelming majority of those statements are related to this question: compared to what? Okay? So, for example, some companies may prefer in this very abstract discussion a carbon tax to a cap-and-trade program. Or some companies may prefer a carbon tax to the raft of duck bites known as command and control regulation under existing law, purportedly under existing law. And I'm here to tell you that in my belief, not as a climate scientist and not as an economist, but as a political scientist, that trade-off, that coupling of regulatory reform to the adoption of a carbon tax will be exceedingly difficult to pull off. There are some people in Congress who view the Clean Air Act as right up there with the Magna Carta and the Code of Hammurabi. I mean, it was inspired word of God. It was announced by a burning bush. All right? So the chances of comprehensive, and by the way, it would take comprehensive Clean Air Act reform, throwing the hood up and fiddling around with the engine to take out the assertion of carbon jurisdiction, particularly in light of Commonwealth of Mass and other tools or clubs the agency possesses at this point. All right? So it would take effort to do that. The political consensus for that effort is high, in my judgment, would be higher to achieve than the political consensus to adopt a carbon tax. And therefore, the notion that an economically rational trade-off could occur, whereby a monitored, carefully organized carbon tax could replace the harem-scarum of current regulation, I think is a false choice. Is not likely to occur. I will say the tax code is not without flaw. Okay? So there are things that could be done. There are things that are currently under discussion that could provide some welcome relief, or at least an interesting discussion that is not a carbon tax discussion. We've had, for example, Chris Coons in Delaware and a bipartisan group. And I'm not endorsing this. I'm just suggesting that it's an alternative discussion that's going on. of extending the master limited partnership tax status to renewable and energy efficiency and combined heat and power projects and that of the like. That is another way. Everyone always talking about, got to price carbon, got to price carbon. Well, you can also remove barriers to alternative energy too, and that's another way to move alternative energies to market. You don't have to price carbon necessarily to do that. That's under consideration. There's discussion at the Treasury Department of looking at the definition of the REIT, the Real Estate Investment Trust tax status as an ability. So all of that is under consideration. Again, there are pros and cons to those approaches, but they don't require an economy-wide carbon tax deal. Putting my ERCC or Electric Reliability Coordinating Council hat on for a moment, I will say we have a report also, because that's what the good Lord needs, is another report on carbon taxes. And I'm a little jealous that your report is out, Jim, because it is so comprehensive. But we have a report that we're going to release at some point, but that does deal a little bit more with the regressivity issue, because that's a sticking point for me.
You said that because I was thinking, my God, I missed that one.
Yeah. No, we're going to spend a lot of time on that. Look, if you look at consumption of energy in this country, the folks, those who can least afford it are the ones who are most sensitive to increases in energy bills. Even though in an absolute sense, the wealthiest quintile may pay more on a per capita basis, but as a percentage of household income, they pay far less. So any policy like this, whether it be a command and control regulation, a carbon tax, or cap and trade, all must tread very carefully on issues of regressivity. A carbon tax bears a higher burden because it is a tax. And one way that the United States has decided as a matter of public policy to address the general income inequalities in the country is through our progressive income tax system. So as a tax, I believe it bears special scrutiny as to whether or not it reverses the regressivity in the tax code. So anyway, or the progressivity, I should say, in the tax code. All right, well, I've talked enough, so I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to hand this. I'm going to redistribute.
I'm not sure you're redistributing wealth.
Right, that's right.
I want to join Jeff in thanking all of you for coming and thank Jim for a truly outstanding paper. The hard part of being last on a panel is it's hard to find something that hadn't already been said, but the good news of that is you speak less. When I began my career, I was with an affiliate of the University of Rochester, the Systems Analysis of the Navy, and we believe that facts and data and hard-headed analysis were a good foundation for public policy. We've reached a point in life where those have been replaced by policy based on illusion, assumption, and a compulsion to do something. Jeff hates it when I mention Daniel Borston because I mention it so often, he gets tired of it. But in his book, The Image, which was written in 1964, he made the observation that, quote, "We are daily less interested in whether something is a fact than whether it is convenient that it should be believed." That describes the climate change world and the put a price on carbon crowd. Jim mentioned that the economists who support a carbon tax base it on the premise that CO2 emissions from using fossil energy are having an adverse impact on the climate system. That at best is a hypothesis. But they compound that error by accepting a premise that politicians will not view a carbon tax as the equivalent of an ATM, which is an easy way to raise revenue. I think that what surprises me about so many of those economists is that they do not address the public choice implications of a carbon tax, or the fact that politicians will engage in political entrepreneurship and the regulated will find a way to seek gain in the political marketplace. That was the whole basis of Bruce Yandel's Baptist and bootlegger theory, and I would like to see some of those economists address that. Ever since the Clinton-Gore administration, climate advocates have been working on schemes to put a price on carbon. Even before the inauguration, Clinton and Gore made it clear that they were going to take action on climate change by suppressing energy use. The first attempt was the ill-fated BTU tax, which was sold as a deficit reduction tool, but since it discriminated against oil, The real goal was obvious. The BTU proposal was quickly abandoned when it confronted a political and public backlash over its impact on energy prices, jobs, and the economy. The backlash was so severe that BTU became a verb, and no politician wanted to be BTU'd. The BTU debacle was followed by the push for cap and trade in the Kyoto Treaty. And most recently, the Waxman-Markey bill suffered a similar defeat because it was a job killer. The son of the BTU, the carbon tax, is now being pushed as an efficient way to put a price on carbon. The core problem is that it is intended to fix a problem that it exists only in theory. And Jim's explained the theory about greenhouse gases and going up, but it is only a theory. It is not an established fact. The models that produce all these projections of dread are short on science and fact and long on assumption. And as more time passes, their temperature projections diverge more and more from the actual record. The warming that began in the mid-1970s came to a halt 15 plus years ago, and climate advocates have a hard time explaining why. But the fact is that without any government-mandated programs or schemes concocted by Henry Waxman or Barbara Boxer, our emissions of CO2 have been declining, in part because of a very severe recession, but also in part because of the move to natural gas. And EIA projects that they will not return to the 2005 level until 2035. Ben Zeiker at API recently observed that there's nothing efficient about a carbon tax that produces no benefits. If technology is leading to decarbonization, and it is, why push a carbon tax? There are only three reasons: an ideological opposition to fossil energy, a desire by politicians for a source of revenue to feed their insatiable spending habit, and the power that comes from being able to enrich the favored. It's instructive to look across the ocean at the EU's experience with its price on carbon through its cap and trade system. The system has collapsed, and the European Parliament recently refused to prop it up to try and get energy prices higher so that their preferred energy sources would be more competitive. The Wall Street Journal made the observation that this is a quote, "The European Parliament refusal to save a failing program is the true believer equivalent of the Pope renouncing celibacy." There's another instructive lesson from the EU, and that is its tax on consumption called the value-added tax. Over the years, that tax has just gone up. In Germany, it's gone from 10% to almost 20. In France, from 13 to almost 20. There's some countries where it's above 20. I think that tells us a lot about what would happen with a carbon tax in the U.S. I've got a lot of friends who are economists. There's one right there. Carbon taxes are intellectually eloquent, but they are dangerous and complex in practice. And Jim's talked about the theory of taxing something that's bad, but using energy produces things of value that we like, so it's not necessarily a bad. And as Scott mentioned, the regressivity, the Congressional Budget Office in its analysis concluded that it would, quote, impose a larger burden on low-income households. With the economy struggling to avoid slipping back into another recession, 1.5% plus or minus 3%. It's mind-boggling that Congress, with a wink and a nod from the White House, would even be talking about increasing taxes. And now that Henry Waxman's cap and trade proposal has been buried with prejudice, he's turned to a carbon tax, pledging that revenues would be returned to taxpayers. Now I'm going to pause so you can laugh at that. The idea that they're going to return revenue to taxpayers. Let me close with another quote from Ben Zeiker, who commented on the Waxman proposal. Quote, "The carbon tax is little more than a profit opportunity for the Beltway. The real pollution is that created by the politics of wealth distribution. a fundamental corruption of the relationship between citizenry and the state. In other words, it breeds crony capitalism and the unintended consequences that flow from it. Jim and I were talking earlier. I think the real threat that we face is the growth in crony capitalism. It's like a cancer that is metastasized, and it gets worse every year. Cato put out a report in 2006 on the growth in federal government subsidies. It stopped at 2006, but from 1990 to 2006, the number had almost doubled. And I suspect in the last 7 years, it has at least gone up another 20 or 25%. We have a serious problem, but it's not climate change, and it would only be compounded by a carbon tax. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you for those comments. I'll open it up to the floor for questions.
Incubating these comments, for the sake of argument, let's stipulate that there is a social cost of carbon. But I think following up on Jim's original presentation, benefits, and those haven't been taken into account. To do this as proper economists, we need to be counting the potential positive externalities as well. And I suspect that they would be primarily manifest at low income. And so that would feed into this issue of regressivity. But before coming up with figuring what the optimal tax would be, you have to even know what direction it is.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Now, for an externality, it has to be one that's outside of a market transaction. So simply lower prices of electricity wouldn't strictly be an externality. But there are benefits that are very consistent that come out from CO2 on agriculture that people don't seem to want to talk about. And they project that a doubling of CO2 would, by itself, ignoring any increase in technology that we're likely to have over the next 90, 100 years, would increase grain production by about 30% and hardwood production by about 30%. These sorts of things. And in spite of the hysteria around heat waves, the evidence seems overwhelming that cold imposes more health costs than does warmth. And repeated heat waves have less of an impact because people figure out what to do. You don't hear of people dying of heat waves in Miami. It's in Chicago or Paris. And so warming might actually have strict positive externalities in those health effects and in agriculture.
Well, I'm fascinated by this idea that the system doesn't incorporate the benefits of cheap energy. I keep coming back to it. There's got to be some way of taking account of this because, like when you think about the impact of mobility and cheap gasoline on sort of rural areas where people can go out where living is cheaper, apartments are cheaper, land is cheaper than they commute, you vastly expand the shed, and you really increase people's welfare. And yet somehow that isn't getting factored in.
Well, it's just in The Economist, and I'm arguing, sort of defending the profession more than my position. That's not an externality. That's through the market. They're reported. I think you do mention mobility, and I've actually been trying to see if anybody's done any studies on the fact that when we have a lot more people that own cars in the U.S. than a lot of other countries, and when you have this mobility, the economy becomes somewhat more robust, as when you lose jobs in this part of the state, you can go somewhere else. A lot of places in the world, if the better job is 30 miles away, that might be a 2-hour commute by public transportation. You don't do it, you go on the dole. So I think I'm going to try to see if I can get some people to do some research on that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just say, shamelessly advertise something. A couple of weeks ago, House Energy and Commerce Committee did a hearing on a bill that they've introduced called the Energy Consumers Relief Act, which is sort of a mechanism to take into account at the front end what the energy impacts would be of regulations and energy cost impacts, that is. both in terms of price of electricity and in terms of gasoline. Again, not externalities in the strictest sense. We testified at that hearing and tried to put together something which I would encourage folks who act as advocates in this room to also do, which is sometimes we end our narrative at either unemployment statistics or just the raw data that energy prices would go up. I think we have an obligation to explain what that really means in human terms. And what we tried to do, at least in this particular testimony, is to get into what that means to the operational cost of running a hospital, what that means to the cost of running a school district, a university. I mean, many universities in this country operate their own powerhouses that are often based on what we euphemistically these days refer to as solid fossil fuel power plants. And I'll let you in on a little secret. Major donors don't want to give money to a university to build the new powerhouse. I mean, they either want to build an academic building or whatever. So when you have to address the physical plant concerns of a university, that's coming out of tuition. Or it's coming out of the very generous contribution of the state legislature in the case of public school. So, there are trade-offs here, and maybe those aren't externalities in the strictest sense, but there are trade-offs in how much education and healthcare costs based on how much the underlying energy costs.
Scott, if you get someone to go back and review the history of the BTU tax and look at some of the groups that came out against it, one was the Coalition for the Homeless.
Right.
And when someone said to me, we can get the Coalition for the Homeless, I said, they're homeless. 50% at that time worked. They lived in their car. They needed gasoline to get to work. There were shelters in Cleveland that were opposed to it because it would affect their ability
Catholic Charities of Cleveland.
to carry out Catholic charities. So there is a wealth of information, and I do refer to the carbon tax as the son of BTU, and I think that that battle that was waged in '93 will be waged again for exactly the same reasons.
There's a professor, I can't remember his name, out of the San Diego area, and he, in 2008, I think it was 2008, he wrote, published a paper, and it may have been the following year, but he looked at a number of recessions, and just because I can't remember the specific details, say 9 out of 10 recessions were preceded by a spike in energy costs. And if you remember, the summer of 2008, gasoline prices were skyrocketing, and D.C. was surrounded by people in semis who were just screaming at Congress to do something about it. And if you remember, that year, theoretically, we got rid of the moratorium on most of the OCS. President Bush withdrew the presidential moratorium with the exception of the Eastern Gulf. And then Congress did not renew the spending moratorium on planning for any activity in the OCS. So I think there is information and evidence out there that does tie high energy costs to severe dislocation. And so I think this guy's an economist. I have the information.
No. You can look at it. There's always a question of causality, and was this a general run up in commodity prices and so on? But we show that in our paper. Well, you drive the price of energy up with a carbon tax, and you get a negative hit on GDP, personal income, employment goes down, and certainly, there's a great argument for low cost energy. Oh no, there'd definitely be winners. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the carbon tax. I mean, that's how Washington works. Somebody's going to get it.
Wind and solar companies, GE.
Yeah, I don't know. I think they're cleverer than we are. They'll be there. I was sitting next to at the AEI thing with the people talking about we're going to use this 100% revenue neutrality, so on. And did anybody go to that presentation? It was so oversubscribed they had to twice pull dividers back and go into the third room. And I just sat down randomly next to somebody at lunch, and she said, well, you know, we have great plans for that revenue. And she represented an association of, I don't know, mass transit or something. And I'm thinking, okay, what are the odds that I sat down next to the one person in this room that had great plans for that revenue?
Yeah.
You know, and it could be whoever's a chairman here that's, you know, maybe they're, you know, Blumenauer wants more, you know, mass transit and bikes and this and that, or somebody else wants, you know, I think there's going to be subsidies for green technologies. That seems evergreen itself. And talking about universities, I hate to bring this up. I just left 5 years ago from James Madison University, where I was for 20-some years. And then I took my son around to visit colleges a couple of years ago. And there are two fads on campuses. I think the first one is starting to fade, and that is you have to have a climbing wall, or else students won't go if you don't have a climbing wall in your rec center. I'm dead serious. And the other is windmills. You know, we got a windmill. You know, the thing is one of those windmills like this, like they have by the Arboretum down here. You know, maybe you could run a transistor radio on it. But so there is a very green push on universities.
Talk about the greenhouse tax. The problem is we're talking about a carbon tax. It's not a carbon tax. We start with mass versus EPA about greenhouse gases. EPA says I can find an endangerment for 1 molecule of methane, even if I can't find endangerment from 1 molecule of CO2. So my question is, has anybody thought about the impact once the CO2 budget is out there? How long will it take Sierra Club, NRDC, Environmental Defense to say, oh, by the way, you've got this methane stuff out there. I got a greenhouse tax for you. And understanding that methane is more virulent than CO2, okay? At least 25 times, not 72 times. So the question is, has anybody thought about that? And what would it take to have people think about, by the way, if the first wall falls, they're going to get us. Because Sierra Club and NRDC have always said we don't like gas. So it probably comes to you.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of thinking about the question of what the next step is. I mean, you know, we heard some mention about the Environmentalists Beyond Coal campaign begat the one of the other factors that increased reliance on natural gas, and then that begat the Beyond Natural Gas campaign, right? So it's you know it's like entropy, you know, they're sort of chasing the energy out of the system. But here's the deal. Right now there are an array of environmental regulations on the command and control side that are targeted very specifically at methane, whether that be Clean Air Act regulations on pipelines, on processing, flaring requirements, etc. The irony about flaring requirements is that direct releases of methane are perceived as more dangerous to global warming than carbon. So the requirement is that you either put the methane into the pipeline, even if there's no market for it or no infrastructure for that, or you burn it, which means you produce carbon and water vapor, right? You know, I do believe that's how physics works. So there's a preference for carbon, if you will, in flaring over and above what we direct releases of methane. So I would find it very hard to believe that if we actually did take steps in the direction of a carbon tax, that they wouldn't also look at other major greenhouse gases. I mean, it would stand to reason that they would. At the very least, if I control those other greenhouse gases, I want a credit against that carbon tax. So there'll be an incentive either way.
I do think the environmentalists have a strategic sense here, which is that you take the fact that natural gas produces about 60% of the CO2 as coal, and you use that to shift from coal to natural gas. Then at that point you say, oh, by the way, there are all these fugitive methane emissions we need to look at. We forgot about those. It turns out natural gas is every bit as bad as that nasty coal that we just got rid of. We got to get rid of it too.
You know, Randy, building on the brief discussion we had before the panel, it's very likely that in 15 years, they will have 20 years have forgotten what the whole point was in the first place, and it's just a tax. Yeah. And we were talking about the HOV lanes. and how the HOV lanes were designed. We're going to get more people per vehicle. It's going to cut down on congestion. But somehow, one person in a hybrid, even if it's a hybrid SUV that gets 18 miles to the gallon, is worthy. Why? So, I can easily imagine in 15 years saying, well, this is an energy tax, right? Why isn't nuclear paying it?
Yeah.
And on we go.
Sir? Yes, let me reinforce the point about the carbon tax being existing now in the way of gasoline taxes. I did the arithmetic a couple months ago. In the state of Virginia, the combined state and federal gasoline taxes are equivalent to the tax on CO2 of about $42 or $43 per ton. And if you go to the state of California, it's $67 or $68 per ton. The numbers that have been talked about as taxes for CO2 are between 15 and 25, shall we say? We're paying much more now.
Can I one observation I'd like to make on that is, the notion of taxing gasoline in order to replenish the Highway Trust Fund was not based on the notion that we would discourage highway travel. Okay? It, in fact, was based on quite the opposite notion, that there would be an upward curve of use of the infrastructure, and that there were equitable reasons why it was appropriate to tie that to the amount of driving that was going on. I mean, that's sort of conceptually. No, there's no way a highway trust fund linkage to a federal excise tax on gasoline would have ever passed if its proponents would have stood up and said, as a social policy, we believe this will discourage the use of the highway system that we're talking about. And, of course, the data demonstrates that that highway tax does not, or that gasoline excise tax, while it may indeed be regressive, does not really change the behavior, the underlying behavior by discouraging folks from using the resource. I think in the same way, the section, we've heard both Jim and Dave talk about this, and Bill talk about the notion that if you think a carbon tax is really going to reduce, or is really going to have any effect on temperature, for example, I mean, it's crazy, because these are inelastic behaviors that are being addressed here, and that's why I'm so concerned about regressivity. Yeah.
Scott, that brings up another good point that I forgot to address on the carbon tax, and that is a good one. I even looked at what fraction of the highway tax is diverted away from highway use.
It's about 25%.
Yeah, right. And so then you're getting to about a $10 per ton tax on carbon. Even if you say the highway trust fund money stimulates driving when it's spent on highways, the part that goes to museums and bike trails and whatever else. But in any event, I had another point that I was going to make. I've forgotten.
We're sharing.
Oh, no, now I remember it. Sorry, I remember it. Sorry, I remember. Yeah, let's get back to that. The slap on the back jarred it. And that is, some of the people say when we tax carbon, it's going to stimulate all sorts of innovation. We're going to, it's going to be this magical creation of carbon substitute technology. And you get the Marquis and Waxman, they think it's going to make the economy even stronger. You don't find economists saying that, by the way. And the answer is, okay, where is the magic technology that was invented in Europe, where they have, in essence, a couple of 100% tax on carbon? A couple of $100 per ton tax in the transportation sector, where they tax gasoline till it's $8 a gallon. What technologies have they developed? Have anybody been there? Here's the magic technology. You drive in a smaller car and you don't go as far. I don't want that. Is that what the future for us? I have trouble getting excited about less comfort, less safety, and having to take buses more often.
One quick notion on innovation. And I always have this argument with my good friends at the EPA, which is, the notion that a major command and control regulation, or things that increase the cost, for example, of the use of coal,
right,
will spur, quote, innovation. Well, consider this logical syllogism. First, fossil fuel is and will remain jam-packed full of energy, right? There's not a religious reason that compels us to use fossil fuels. It is a very, very efficient way to generate power or to create manufacture fuel for automobiles. Number one. Number two, innovation doesn't just mean spending innovation dollars, time on technologies which we know to be less efficient at generating electricity or generating motor fuels. No, we ought to also consider what the budget is for innovation in the fossil sector. And then number three, if you create a suite of policies, and by the way, overlapping a carbon tax on top of command and control is a signal that the future will not obtain. And you can ask folks at Goldman Sachs the same question: where do you place your investment dollar? And they begin to marginalize, the incremental investment in the fossil sector. Add it all up. It means that policies like this don't encourage innovation in energy, at least in the real sense that it makes a difference in people's lives. In fact, they decrease innovation by making it less likely that investments will be made in the most energy efficient, in terms of the amount of energy per unit of production, which is still in the fossil sector. I put that in comments one time on a reg, and I just got screamed at on the phone.
Well, I'll reinforce your comment in that in connection with my intellectual property work, I know Nathan Myhrvold, who's an intellectual ventures guy, leading innovator and such. And once I was talking to him, trying to convince him that he should be involved in innovation in the energy sector, particularly the fossil sector. And he was amused, to say the least, and did not regard this as a prime target for any effort by venture capitalists or by IV. But at the same time, one of the leading patent holders, of course, and patent getters of patents every year is Exxon. A lot of innovation there from the large companies, but you're not going to get it from anybody who isn't already involved in the system as a big player.
Let me sort of fine-tune what I said earlier. I think there has been a lot of innovation. And you look at just the increase in the efficiency of the internal combustion engine that we have in cars over the past 30 years. It's been phenomenal.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think there's been differential, magical innovation in Europe from their $4 a gallon tax on gasoline.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your comments. Thank you all for joining us today. This is, I'm sure, not the last you'll hear from the Marshall Institute on the carbon tax, and certainly not from many of these gentlemen working on the subject. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.